It was the early morning hours of Monday, July 30th, 2012, when something went terribly wrong in northern India. At first, it seemed like a regular outage, the kind people were sadly used to. Power cuts were nothing new in the country. Millions of people didn't have reliable electricity to begin with. But this time, it wasn't just a neighborhood or a single state going dark. This time, the lights went out for hundreds of millions of people all at once. Around 2:30 in the morning, the northern grid, the massive system that supplied electricity to much of northern India, collapsed. What caused it? A perfect storm of bad timing, overworked lines, and poor communication. Some transmission lines had already been taken offline for scheduled maintenance. On top of that, the monsoon season was placing heavy stress on the remaining lines. At the center of it all was a single transmission route, the 400 kilovolt Bina-Gwalior line, which had become the main lifeline between the northern and western grids. That line was only meant to carry about 700 megawatts of power efficiently, but at the time of failure, it was carrying more than twice that, over 1,400 megawatts. The load was too much. The circuit breakers tripped, and once that line went down, the grid couldn't handle the imbalance. Power that had been flowing from the western region to the northern grid had nowhere to go. The system panicked. The frequency dropped, and in just minutes, the entire northern grid shut down like a switch had been flipped. The blackout spread fast. Over 300 million people were without power, about 1/4 of India's population. Everything stopped. Trains halted on the tracks, traffic lights blinked off, pumps that supplied water to homes and farms shut down, hospitals switched to backup generators, businesses couldn't open their doors, and in cities like Delhi, people woke up confused and frustrated, not knowing the full scale of what had happened yet. India's northern grid had collapsed once before, in January of 2001, but this time the impact was even larger. This blackout wasn't just a failure of technology, it was a warning sign that the entire system was dangerously fragile. But the worst part? This was just the beginning. By the following day, Tuesday, July 31st, 2012, India's power crisis had grown into something far worse. Just as the country was struggling to recover from the massive blackout in the north, another failure struck. This time, it wasn't just one grid that went down, it was three. At around 1 p.m., the northern grid collapsed again, but this time it pulled down the eastern and northeastern grids with it. The chain reaction was immediate and brutal. More than half of the country was now without power. From Punjab in the northwest to West Bengal in the east, the outage stretched across 20 states and union territories. Over 600 million people were affected, nearly half of India's total population. It became the largest blackout in world history. The cause wasn't a mystery. Experts had already warned that the grids were being pushed too hard. Many states were overdrawing power, taking more electricity than they were supposed to, from the shared national system. Despite warnings from the central authority, these states continued to ignore safe limits. As a result, the grid was always teetering on the edge of collapse. The second failure started much like the first. When demand outstripped supply, key transmission lines tripped. Once again, the system's frequency dropped rapidly. This time, the stress wasn't limited to the north. The eastern and northeastern grids, which had been helping supply extra power, were also overwhelmed. Within minutes, the blackout spread like a wave. Unlike the earlier outage that happened in the dead of night, this second collapse struck in the middle of a workday. Millions of workers were suddenly stranded. Over 300 trains came to a stop, trapping thousands of passengers in sweltering heat. In Delhi, traffic snarled into chaos as signal lights blinked out again. Across rural areas where diesel generators were rare, farmers watched helplessly as irrigation pumps stopped working during the peak of the growing season. Coal production was hit hard too. Mines in eastern India had to suspend operations and evacuate workers from underground tunnels for safety. Airports switched to emergency power, metro systems ground to a halt, and communication towers across vast regions began running out of backup fuel. The mood in the country shifted quickly. What had first seemed like a technical glitch now looked like a national emergency. Questions flooded in from all sides. Who was responsible? Why weren't there safeguards in place? And most urgently, could it happen again? While much of India sat in the dark on the afternoon of Tuesday, July 31st, 2012, a race was underway behind the scenes. Engineers, technicians, and officials worked frantically in control rooms across the country, trying to understand what had gone wrong and how to bring the grid back online without triggering another collapse. The first priority was to stabilize the northern grid, which had now failed twice in less than 24 hours. But the challenge was enormous. In India, each regional power grid connects to others through what are known as interconnectors, critical lines that help transfer electricity between zones. When one region overloads or fails, the effects can spill into others unless isolated quickly. This time, the domino effect had already taken place. Experts from the Power System Operation Corporation and the National Load Dispatch Center started isolating damaged sections of the grid, blocking off lines that had caused the overload. They then began the slow, delicate task of restarting what is known as a black start, rebooting power generation without an existing electrical supply to work with. This process relied heavily on hydroelectric plants, which could be started more easily than coal-fired stations. Meanwhile, across many cities and rural towns, backup systems kicked in. Hospitals activated emergency generators to keep life support equipment running. Airport control towers switched to battery power. In places where diesel fuel was in short supply, resourceful workers rationed electricity, powering only the most essential equipment. One major concern was water. In cities like Delhi and Jaipur, the electric pumps used to supply water to homes and apartments had stopped working. Thousands of residents had no running water for drinking, cooking, or washing. Some climbed down to ground-level tanks and carried buckets back upstairs by hand. Telecommunication networks also came under pressure. Mobile towers depend on electricity to transmit signals, and although most had some backup power, not all could run for extended periods. Calls dropped. Internet access slowed or disappeared completely. In some regions, local radio stations were the only available source of news and updates. While politicians gave statements promising swift action and accountability, much of the real work was being done quietly by teams of engineers. Many had not slept in over a day. They coordinated by phone and radio, manually adjusting circuits and voltage levels to prevent further failures. Each restored line was tested, monitored, and connected slowly to avoid another shock to the fragile system. By late evening, power had been partially restored in parts of Delhi, Uttar Pradesh, and West Bengal. Still, large portions of the country remained in the dark. Though the immediate danger was being contained, the grid remained dangerously unstable. One more mistake could have triggered a third and possibly even larger outage. The blackout had revealed something deeper. The energy system of one of the world's largest nations was under tremendous strain, stretched far beyond what it had been designed to handle. As power slowly returned to India's cities and villages, energy officials began a deeper investigation into what had triggered the massive breakdown. By Wednesday, August 1st, 2012, it had become clear that this was not the result of a single failure, but a chain of problems that had been building for years. At the center of the crisis was an overloaded power grid. India's electricity demand had been steadily increasing, driven by population growth, rising industrial activity, and a push for economic development. Yet the country's energy infrastructure had not kept pace. Power lines, substations, and transformers in many regions were aging and poorly maintained. Some parts of the system were operating dangerously close to their maximum capacity even under normal conditions. One of the most critical issues was the practice of overdraw. Several states, including Uttar Pradesh, Haryana, and Punjab, had reportedly been drawing more electricity than they were officially allocated. This created an imbalance in the national grid. Instead of raising alarms and enforcing penalties, regulators had often looked the other way, partly due to political pressure and partly because there were no clear consequences in place. Adding to the strain was the seasonal nature of electricity demand. July marked the height of India's summer monsoon season. While the rains brought relief from the heat, they also reduced solar generation and sometimes caused hydroelectric output to fluctuate. At the same time, farmers relied heavily on electric pumps for irrigation. These pumps were often unregulated and switched on simultaneously, placing an enormous and unpredictable load on the system. Another weakness exposed by the blackout was the lack of real-time communication between regional grids. Each zone, north, east, northeast, west, and south, was responsible for its own stability. But when trouble started in the northern grid on July 30th, warnings were not passed fast enough to the others. As a result, the eastern and northeastern grids were caught off guard the next day, leading to a much wider failure. India's dependence on coal-fired power plants also played a role. These plants were already underperforming due to low coal supplies and outdated equipment. When the blackout struck, many of them could not restart quickly. Their slow recovery meant that other sources like hydro and gas had to pick up the slack, placing more pressure on limited resources. Despite growing investments in renewable energy, The country's grid still lacked modern features like automated load balancing, smart monitoring, and digital fault detection. These tools could have helped detect the warning signs earlier and possibly prevented the cascade. In the aftermath, officials pointed fingers in multiple directions, at state governments for overdrawing, at regulators for failing to enforce limits, and at outdated infrastructure for not being able to handle the load, but the truth was more complex. The blackout was not caused by a single bad decision. It was the result of a system that had been neglected, stretched, and patched together for too long without proper oversight. The events of those 2 days served as a painful lesson, showing just how fragile a modern nation's power supply can be when growth outpaces planning and when accountability is replaced with avoidance. In the days and weeks following India's massive blackout, efforts shifted from restoring power to understanding what needed to change to prevent another disaster of this scale. For millions of Indians, the outage was more than an inconvenience. It was a wake-up call that exposed the weaknesses of a growing nation. Caught between rapid development and aging infrastructure, the Indian government ordered a full investigation, committees were formed, engineers were interviewed, and reports were drafted. Among the key recommendations was the urgent need to upgrade the national power grid with modern technology. This included real-time data systems, better communication between regional zones, stricter control over how much electricity states could draw, and penalties for violations that would actually be enforced. There was also growing pressure to increase investment in energy generation itself. India's dependence on coal had long caused problems, from fuel shortages to environmental concerns. After the blackout, attention turned more seriously toward diversifying power sources. Solar and wind energy projects received a boost, and hydroelectric stations were evaluated for reliability and expansion. In a significant policy shift, India's Power Grid Corporation began work on integrating a nationwide smart grid. This would allow operators to track electricity flows more accurately and respond to issues before they became catastrophic. It would also help balance loads across the country by shifting power from surplus areas to those in need in real time. International observers took note. The blackout became a case study in energy conferences around the world. Engineers, policymakers, and disaster planners used it as an example of what happens when demand outpaces infrastructure and when enforcement of grid regulations is overlooked. Countries with rapidly growing populations and developing power systems, including those in Southeast Asia and parts of Africa, took particular interest in India's experience. In India itself, the blackout changed how citizens thought about electricity. In the past, frequent power cuts were accepted as part of daily life, but after July 30th and 31st of 2012, the sheer scale of the failure forced a cultural shift. Businesses invested in backup generators, hospitals upgraded emergency systems, households began to conserve energy more carefully, and discussions around sustainable power entered public conversation in a way they never had before. The blackout didn't just knock out power, it highlighted a deeper issue. It showed that development without planning and growth without investment in maintenance could carry enormous risks. India's economy had been expanding rapidly, but its power grid had not kept up. The event brought energy planning to the forefront of national priorities and forced leaders to face uncomfortable truths. While power was restored within the days, rebuilding trust in the system took far longer, but the crisis served a purpose. It forced action, not just promises. It marked the moment when India began to take a long, hard look at its energy future and started building a system strong enough to support its ambitions.